Now we're going to talk about three of the shortcomings of scientism that you list in this article on coldcasechristianity.com called the shortcomings of scientism. And the first one you mention, you say this in your article, so you first and perhaps most importantly, scientism cannot meet its own standard, you say. So tell me, why is it that you don't think that scientism can meet its own standard?
So scientism is the claim that the hard sciences alone can answer all questions. That's the only place that we need to go for truth. And that's essentially what Atkins is arguing in his article that we talked about in the first segment, that, hey, the questions worth asking are the ones that can be answered by science. But this statement alone, the statement that the hard sciences can bring you to all knowledge, scientism says that this itself is a true statement. But scientism, that statement, cannot be measured scientifically. We can't create a experiment in which we can test whether or not science is the only way we could know truth. So it doesn't meet its own standard. There must be at least one other way to know truth, because we can, in order to arrive at the claim that science is the only way to know truth, we must use a different process. We could not use science itself.
Right. So the claim that, hey, all truth is discovered by science is not something you can discover with science. That's a philosophical position that precedes any endeavor you take. So in other words, this is when you see this a lot when people who write under purely scientific backgrounds make strong philosophical mistakes in their writings, where they presume that, as I think it was Dawkins who said that philosophy was dead, or maybe it was Hawking who said that philosophy is dead, it has no role to play, which itself is a philosophy about his endeavor in the sciences. And so again, you have to be careful that you don't make self-refuting statements. And this is one of these things that is self-refuting, because it cannot itself be discovered by way of scientific methods that you think are the only way to discover something.
So and I don't expect the scientist to be able to understand every complex philosophical argument, because, hey, that's not their area of expertise. Just as I don't expect the philosopher to understand every minute, thing that's going on in science. But I think that if we're really on a mission to find just the truth of reality, we got to understand that there's multiple modes of inquiry that we could use, and that we probably should respect each of them, because they can each bring us some aspect of the truth that together is going to form our view of reality. If we just limit ourselves to science, we're totally ignoring so much of the available knowledge that's out there.
Yeah, and I think that's a good important point. It's not as though we are saying, well, no, we reject taking a scientific approach to anything. No, we're just saying it's part of the tool kit that you use epistemologically to know certain claims. As a matter of fact, we think that you can know a lot about God by simply collecting the scientific data that some of these atheist scientists are collecting to try to demonstrate that God doesn't exist. This is what I wrote about in a book called God's CrimeScene, where we're just looking at all the same scientific data, but what is the better inference? Is something that our good friend Frank Turek often says, is that science doesn't say anything, scientists do. The science is just the collection of data, but the inference you draw from science can often be colored by your bias. It can be influenced by your bias. And if your bias is that there are no supernatural forces at all worth talking about, and that everything has to be described naturalistically using space-time, matter, physics, and chemistry, well, that limitation leads you to certain places. But let's go to your second shortcoming that you mentioned in your article, the shortcomings of scientism. Secondly, you say there are a number of important truths which cannot be measured or tested scientifically. So not only is it self-refuting, you're saying that there are certain aspects of reality that you can't even measure or test. Well, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think we kind of briefly alluded to it in the first segment, that there's these ideas, some of them are the big questions of life that science itself doesn't really directly speak to. The questions of morality. What is right and wrong? How should I live my life? How should I treat my neighbor? These are not questions that we could really go to the hard sciences to answer. Now, I think that all of us, or everyone I've ever met, let's put it that way, would say that there is a right and wrong way to act. Yet we must have to go to some other source of information in order to figure out these ideas of moral truths. Or
okay, let me push back on you though, because people like there are people out there who are writing as thinkers, who would say, well, no, it's about human flourishing. So science can tell you how you ought to behave, because if you behave in a way that increases human flourishing, then that is the right way to behave. And we can measure human flourishing, they would say, scientifically. So the science does tell you how you ought to behave. What would you say to that?
That's actually a great question, and I think it comes down to, it's almost the same. The problem with the question you just asked is the same problem that scientism itself has, and that's that the base of your claim was that right and wrong is all based on human flourishing. That's how we're going to measure it. But that claim itself, that human flourishing should be the measurement, that claim cannot be measured scientifically. So even though the claim supports, hey, we're going to use a scientific method, the claim itself cannot be tested scientifically. It's sort of like what Atkins does in his article, where he says, hey, the questions that science can answer are the questions that are worth asking. Questions that science can't are not real questions, are not meaningful.
And not worth asking.
But that claim that those are not worth asking cannot be tested scientifically. So that question or that claim would be one of those questions that he's saying that you should never even answer. You shouldn't even consider those types of things. So even if you do not take a Christian perspective on something, at the very least, we cannot appeal to only science alone. Even if you draw a conclusion that's different than mine, let's be fair. We cannot use science alone to ask the question. There's other things we can learn out there that go beyond the hard sciences that we can know that are actually true.
Yeah, and even the idea that language is important and test people's language. When someone says that flourishing is the high goal of biology and all biological systems, really, it's survivability, really. Do you mean survivability? No, I mean flourishing. Because if it's survivability, then eating your neighbor and all of his food and destroying that entire clan is actually going to help you survive better. Survivability as a goal often leads to misbehavior historically, and people would point to that. But we're saying, no. There's a certain kind of survival. Oh, now hold on. Now you've embedded ethical standards you cannot get by way of science. You have a philosophical view of how we ought to live, not just that we ought to live, but how we ought to live. And now you've dipped your toe in those waters that are outside of what science can actually explain. So I think that's part of the language trick, is that flourishing it means in some way to the person. It's Sam Harris who makes this claim, by the way, but the idea of flourishing actually steals from an ethical view of survivability that he doesn't have leverage yet. He doesn't have the ability to explain that scientifically yet. Anyway,
the bottom line is these big questions, or the questions that science can't answer, are often the questions that we ask most frequently.
Yep.
On a daily basis. We might not ask, unless we're a scientist, a scientific question, but we might ask questions about, like, who am I, or who should I be? Who do I want to be? Questions of identity.
Right. And how should we live?
Yes, and these are the most meaningful and most common questions, but these are the very questions that science cannot answer. It's not designed to answer those.
Right, and this is why Peter Atkins says those are out-of-bound questions anyway. Let's go to the last piece now. The last shortcoming of scientism, you say, is that there are a number of presuppositions one must hold in order to engage with scientific inquiry in the first place. So what do you mean by that?
Yeah, if we just stick to just the hard sciences, now we're going to be using things like mathematics, logic. We're going to create experiments that we're going to try to draw some type of empirical data from. But the problem is that we're making some presuppositions about the empirical data itself and how we can use it. Ideas of mathematics that 1 + 1 will always equal 2, although they are true, they cannot be tested scientifically. We have to assume that that's true so that we can run our experiment. Same thing with ideas of laws of logic or reasoning. We have to assume that if we're going to do a test on an animal, we have to assume that that animal really exists and will exist in some state, consistent state throughout our experiments, so that we can see if our experiment is really working or not. But those are just assumptions we have to go into. We can't do a scientific experiment to learn if math is true. We believe math is true so that we can do our scientific experiment.
Yeah, there's these basic laws that we assume are true, and the law of non-contradiction, other kinds of laws, mathematical facts we assume, and mathematical relationships we assume are true, and then there are a bunch of like metaphysical kinds of questions that we assume are true, like that the physical world around us is real. So I think that's another. So you've basically broken down the shortcomings in three categories. One, you've said, hey, this is self-refuting to begin with, which ought to give us pause before we even look at the other two. And two, that there are a number of important truths that just are not accessible through science. And three, that there are a number of presuppositions which you assume before you even start doing science. And knowledge of those areas are not they have to precede the science, not as a result of the science. And what I want to do is point people to an article written by some people that we also are very familiar with. Its article is called 12 Things That Science Can't Explain. It's at scienceandskeptics.org. I'm sorry, saintsandskeptics.org. So I've got it here on the screen for you to take a look at it. And here's what's great about it. They actually point and link to that famous debate or conversation between Peter Atkins, the article's author, we're kind of ending where we started, and William Lane Craig, in which he makes a claim in front of William Lane Craig that, that science is the arbiter of truth. And William Lane Craig says, hey, there's actually a number of things that science can't explain. And you can tell in the first conversation, Jimmy, that Peter Atkins is like, really? Like what? Like he doesn't believe. And then he lists these, and I'll just read them from the article for you. He says, number one, things you've already talked about, logical and mathematical truths, which are presupposed by science. That science cannot determine those, science relies on those. Two, metaphysical truths, like the past was not created 5 minutes ago with the appearance of age. Or that we're not in a computer simulation. We are actually, the physical world around us is real. There are minds other than our own. These are things that cannot be determined with science. Three, ethical truths, moral truths of right and wrong. And four, aesthetic truths, which we didn't even talk about. It claims about beauty, what's ugly. Even if you said, oh, the inner mechanisms of this cell are beautiful, you have to have a notion of why that would be beautiful by definition, which you cannot get from science. And finally, science itself, as you said. But he argues that science itself is based on assumptions that can't be proven, therefore you cannot prove. So that's a slightly different twist, but it's kind of like going back to your self-refuting notion. Now, look, we're coming up to the end of our podcast this week, but before we go, I just want to point people to another article. You've written two articles, really, that kind of dig into this on our website. The other one is this one. I want to point people to it, and that is this article called The Bias of Secular Science Coverage. And it really just kind of talks about how many scientists will offer an explanation for the beginning of the universe, let's say, but then they will kind of back out and only offer the naturalistic explanations and report on those and kind of deny out any possibility that there's a supernatural agent causation to the universe. I just want to give you 30 seconds to kind of talk about that article and why you wrote it.
Yeah, I just think that there's a number of, sometimes we'll ask a certain question like how did the universe begin, and there'll be a number of different hypotheses. But often I'll see we want to focus, or at least the media will want to focus on only those which hold a very hard materialistic perspective. And even though there are competing and sometimes even superior theistic models, we won't include those. Or even if it's not strictly theistic, some type of supernatural model, we won't include those. We want to stick to just the naturalist. But I think if we look at the basic problem with with scientism is that it sticks too hard to just science alone. And I think that's kind of the problem we're seeing with a lot of media coverage is we're only looking at science to find our answers, even though there's other areas we could go to find truth.
Yeah, it's true that the media around us is kind of an embedded scientism as well. We're up against that hard break, and so that's all we have time for this week.
Thanks for joining us on this edition of the Cold Case Christianity Broadcast. We'll see you next week.